Please be seated. It's December 1938, and a museum curator in South Africa named Marjorie Courtney Latimer gets a call from some local fishermen because they know that she's interested in weird things that sometimes turn up in their nets, and they were looking at something that none of them had ever seen before. She raced to see it and later described it as 5 feet long, a pale mauvey blue color with faint flecks of whitish spots, and an iridescent silver blue-green sheen all over it. It was covered in hard scales and had 4 limb-like fins and a strange puppy dog tail. There was no record of anything like it in any of her books, but eventually some other experts identified it as a coelacanth, a species of fish that everyone, and I mean everyone, knew had been extinct for 65 million years. But here one was, right in front of them. And since then, many others have turned up along the coast of East Africa and around Indonesia. Coelacanths are often called living fossils, which I guess is intentionally ironic, like jumbo shrimp, but I think it's really unfair because these creatures are clearly not some ossified ancient artifact that has been magically brought back to life. They are living entities which have been tough enough to survive 65 million years worth of changing conditions. So, okay, fascinating. Why am I telling you a story about the discovery of the coelacanth this morning? Because we live in a society where an awful lot of people view all forms of religion, but maybe especially Christianity, as a kind of coelacanth, as a living fossil, with emphasis on the fossil. Religion, in the eyes of many, is a set of atavistic beliefs and practices that continue to hang on despite all of the perfectly logical reasons why they should have disappeared. We also live in a country where stories about church decline and the rise of the nuns, N-O-N-E-S, are so ubiquitous that they rarely even make headlines anymore. One study I read recently found that over the past 25 years, somewhere around 40 million adults, people who grew up in the church or were used to going to church, 40 million of them have effectively stopped going to church. And this church decline is happening across all denominations, all age groups, all educational levels, all income brackets. At the same time, we also live in a culture that has developed what the U.S. Surgeon General just last year described as, quote, an epidemic of loneliness and isolation. Which doesn't just mean that there are more sad and lonely people out there. It does, but all those lonely people are also at increased risk for all kinds of health problems. Heart disease, stroke, dementia. And according to a Gallup poll last year, the highest levels of loneliness were reported to be right here in New England. So here we are in an increasingly polarized world, filled with institutions which fewer and fewer people trust, and which continue to be organized around and largely maintained by historically dominant and domineering power structures, which at best are ill-suited to respond to the complex and rapidly developing challenges we face, and at worst are actively pouring gas on a fire that is already raging out of control. And as I stand here this morning in the midst of this ecosystem, in the midst of this community, with our relative security, our significant privilege, our wealth of abundant gifts, and our own real and pressing challenges, right? We need additional leadership for our family ministry. We're looking at some significant, not insurmountable, but significant capital needs, etc. Standing in the midst of all of this, I continue to wonder and listen hard for what it is that God is really calling us to do, to create, to build. And what I am very sure of is that we are definitely not called to be a fossil, living or otherwise, because Christ calls us to life, to living, to life abundant. We are called to be the church in this present time and to build and become the church for God's future, not some mythic past. The people in Capernaum were astonished by Jesus, not because his teaching was fresh and new, but because it was deeply grounded in the reality of who and what God is. People recognized Jesus' authority not because he moved fast and broke things, but because he recalled them to a primordial truth that is always there. The prophets which God raises up always recall us to this basic truth, that God, the great I Am, is with us always, and wants us, needs us, to be a blessing for all of creation, to proclaim good news to the poor, to lift up the lowly, to bind up the brokenhearted. The church, the people of God, has always existed within a variety of ecosystems, not entirely of our own making. Now, true, we have not been around as long as a coelacanth, but time is relative, and a few thousand years is still a pretty long time. And throughout all of that time that we have been around, we have been constantly changing and adapting to our environment. And how we carry out God's mission of being a blessing and proclaiming good news has also varied greatly over time and across every location. How are we called to be the version of the church that is needed at this time and in this place? That, I think, is the core question. And let me rephrase it slightly. How can our Christian faith and our Anglican traditions help us to live lives of meaning and purpose in this time and this place? And given our faith and our history, who are we called to be in this time of multiple and ongoing and newly developing crises? These are the questions that we will need to continually reflect on and answer together as we live into all that God needs us to do in the coming weeks and months and years. And over lunch at these tables, you're going to have an opportunity to reflect on this. Now, the questions that we've prepared for the table discussions are much less meta than the ones that I just named. They're a lot more concrete. They are things like, where do you go when you're not here? What kind of lives are we sending you into? And how does what we do here equip you to live those lives and to do that work? And what would you need to be better equipped? But the goal of all of these questions is the same. The goal is to help all of us understand how we can resist becoming ossified, becoming fossils, and remain living, evolving, thriving agents of God's grace in a world that clearly, desperately needs it. Amen.